This program comes from a project that I started and then shelved. I was trying to cover some basics of 1970s telephony architecture. I was talking about Bell versus independent territories, and then I realized that I could actually show you that you can hear a difference even if you don't know much about the network. Well, the overall project just hasn't come together, so I'm releasing this as a standalone. And let me apologize in advance to my regular listeners of the tapes. You've heard the standard Bell system rings so much that what I do later may constitute an insultingly easy quiz. But in any case, here is this segment, which was originally intended as part of a larger introductory program. The time period of my tapes is 1970 through 1987. During this time, there's actually only one telephone company serving any particular geographical area. That seems strange nowadays, but wherever you are, there's only one. Generally, the telephone companies were divided into two categories, Bell and independent. The Bell companies were those that were wholly or partly owned by AT&T. The others were referred to as independents. Usually, you could tell whether an area that you were calling to was Bell or independent just by the way the ringtone sounded. By ringtone, I don't mean what it means nowadays. I mean the sound that you hear when you are making a call to someone else and their phone is ringing and you're waiting for them to answer. Nowadays, that typically sounds something like this. Not exactly a thing of beauty, is it? But in the past, that sounded like this. And we only started to hear that in 1965 in very, very few places. Meanwhile, the rest of the network sounded more like this, or this, and there are many more. Some standard ringtones for the Bell system would be these that follow, and the phone phreaks had names for each type. That's called city ring. That's high city ring. That's crossbar ring. Old crossbar ring. New CDO ring. And CDO ring. CDO stands for Community Dial Office. It's a small central office in a rural area that's normally unattended. The CDOs that had the earliest installed equipment rang like this, and the newer ones rang like this. When it came to ringing machines, the Bell system was very predictable because you kept hearing those ring types everywhere. But many of them had a lot of variation, one to another. For example, there were no two city ring machines that sounded exactly alike. Now, the independent companies had completely different ringtones, and there was even a larger variety. This first group of independent ringtones are the ones that initially sounded pretty similar to me, and both I and Bill Acker used to think of them as, independent. But of course, when I got to know them, I found that each one of these is distinct and recognizable. Here they are with the names I've given them. It's not important to remember the names. That's typical AE ring. West Los Angeles ring. Ouch, loud AE ring. Ah, such a relief after that last. That's St. Thomas ring. Warwick Valley ring. Kenley ring. NX1 ring. I'm calling this one Woodbridge ring for the Woodbridge, Occoquan, Dale City, Virginia area.
The number you have reached in Occoquan, Virginia is not in service or has been changed.
AE is Automatic Electric, the manufacturing arm of General Telephone and Electronics, the owner of the General Telephone Company, the largest independent. NX1 is a type of switching equipment that we especially appreciate. It's one of a large variety of crossbar-based systems. Now, those independent ringtones I just played, do sound very much alike when you're first exposed to them. But the Independents had a variety that went beyond those rings that sound somewhat similar. For example, Stromberg CDO ring, Wilson ring, and now here's a variety of other independent rings that I haven't given names to. You get the idea. And of course, both Bell and independent companies had modern ring, and also there were examples in both Bell and independent of what I'm calling pseudo-modern ring. This is a ringtone being generated by what is essentially an old-fashioned ringing machine, but the tone frequencies used are the same as in modern ring. Here's a Bell example, and here's an independent. You can tell that the 20 Hz component that actually rings the telephone bells is mixed into this ringtone. That's not the case with the modern audible ringtone. So that's why I call it pseudo-modern ring. Thanks to the differences between Bell and independent ringtones, we can call anywhere in the continental US and pretty much tell whether it's a Bell or independent company, unless we get a modern or pseudo-modern ring. Even those had minor details that would give a clue, but we won't be going over that right now. Also, the Rochester Telephone Company, an independent in Upper New York State, had a tendency to have Bell System equipment, including Bell System rings, so they were an exception. So let's listen to a few long-distance calls that do include a ringtone, and for each of these long-distance calls, if it's one of these tones, it's the Bell System. But if it's not one of those, it's an independent. The actual rings we get will be slightly different from those because every ringing machine is slightly different, and we'll be hearing them over long distance. Those samples I just played are recorded on local connections. This is what the dialing portion of the call sounds like. In the other examples, I'll skip this and cut right to the call going through. What do you think? Bell or independent? Well, the pitch of that tone is very close to the Bell System's city ring, but it's clearly different. And the Bell System examples here will all be one of these. So this is independent. And by the way, it's a fairly typical AE ring. Next example. Now, where might you hear this? Bell or independent? Well, that's an example of what we called crossbar ring or crossbar 5 ring. Actually, it was the Southern California freaks who called it crossbar ring because in LA in the 1970s, the only crossbar there was number 5 crossbar from Pacific Telephone, a Bell company. In any case, that's about as Bell as you can get. I should mention here that crossbar ring is also found on number 1 steps in the Bell System. And in one exceptional case on number 1 crossbar, the Laurelton Queen's office. So when you hear this, it's probably crossbar 5 or step, and it's definitely bell. Next call. Bell or independent? Well, that's not one of the bell system rings, so it's independent. That's actually a fairly common ring called Kenley ring. That is my locally recorded example. The pitch is slightly different, but it's the same type. Next one. This should sound familiar to anyone who's heard the tapes. Is this a bell ring or an independent one? Well, this is the ring that the phone freaks called City Ring. It's very dull. Definitely one of the main bell system rings for the US, namely these. There it is again. Next call. Now this is one of those toneless rings. It can be hard to get to know those, but listen again. Let's play the bell system rings for a minute. Wait a second. Go back 2. And our long distance call? That's a near perfect match. This is what they called Old Crossbar Ring. Again, this was named by the Southern California freaks. They should have called it Old Crossbar 5 Ring. And this particular ring is only found on number 5 crossbar. So that's a bell system ring. Like these, which I haven't featured yet. At this point, anything that's not one of those 3 is independent. Next call. What do you think, bell or independent? Well, that's not one of the bell system rings. It is, however, one of the independent rings that I gave a name to because it is found in general telephone areas, such as West Los Angeles and the Tampa Bay area, as well as some smaller places that aren't general telephone. I call it West Los Angeles ring. Now here's an example that has 2 rings. What do you think about this ring here, bell or independent? Well, that second ring is a bell system standard ring. It's High City ring, which through that very attenuated long distance connection sounds like this. But there was another ring that we heard at the beginning of the call, this. That's two ring bursts very close together. The second one is actually being used to signal an operator that this is an intercept call. Intercept in telephony usually refers to the handling of a vacant number or a vacant office code having been dialed. In this case, it's a vacant number. What kind of ring is this, Bell or independent? Well, that's one of those independent rings, which I later came to know as St. Thomas ring. Although on this example it's pretty distorted and doesn't sound very soothing. What's happening here is that we are actually calling an independent location, but the number we were calling is non-working, so it has to be handled by an intercept operator, and the intercept operators are coming from a Bell system company. And that's why you hear first an independent ring, then that same ring being used to signal an operator that this is an intercept call. Then you hear a Bell system ring, and the Bell system intercept operator answering. So that call was to an independent, but it gets its intercept from Bell system operators. So it's pretty easy to tell Bell from independent in the US, notwithstanding the fact that occasionally you will hear a Bell ring calling non-working numbers in some independents. Now in Canada, it's mostly the same, but there are a few more exceptions. First of all, I don't think I've ever heard High City ring coming from Canada. It's possible that I have forgotten, but I cannot think of any place that I've heard High City ring. Regular city ring we do hear in Canada. And that's one of the exceptions, because while the western provinces of Canada are 100% independent, with most ringtones clearly reflecting that, those are from Saskatchewan, those independent companies did own some Bell system manufactured long-distance switches, and in the big downtown buildings in places like Regina and Calgary. It's an independent company, but thanks to the Bell system manufactured crossbar tandem long-distance switches in those downtown buildings, the downtowns had City ring. But the biggest problem for my claim that you can tell if it's Bell or independent by the ringtone is something else that comes from Canada, namely this. We phone freaks call it Canada ring. Now, as far as I can tell, this ring machine is either made or at the very least distributed by Northern Electric, the Canadian manufacturing arm of the Bell system. And so it ends up going to Bell Canada central offices, especially number 5 crossbars in Ontario and Quebec. However, independents also like to use Northern Electric equipment, and that's a good thing because it was Northern Electric payphones that enabled us to record so many of the independents that we caught in the United States. But anyway, thanks to the fact that it's from Northern Electric, this ring in the United States and in most of Canada is a sure sign that you're calling an independent. But if you're hearing that ring in Ontario or Quebec, the provinces where Bell Canada operates, it probably is Bell Canada. Now, I've been asked about the manufacturers of the various ring machines, but unfortunately that is something we never found out because we didn't ask. I know that City ring and Crossbar ring were not made by Western Electric, but they were distributed by Western. And the way I know is that they both have KS numbers. KS 5286 for City ring, KS 15532 for Crossbar ring. And to let Joe and Grecia explain this,
KS numbers are numbers that are put on Western Electric products that are not made by Western Electric. They're bought from other companies for the use of the Bell system. These can either be 4 or 5-digit numbers preceded by the letters KS. KS stands for Kearney specification. Kearney is the Western Electric plant in Kearney, New Jersey.
Spelled Kearney, pronounced Carney, The point is that even the most Bell of the Bell rings weren't made by Bell. So that's a question that will have to remain unanswered, except by collectors who have managed to preserve some of these things, where I'm sure it says the manufacturer on the machine itself. I've seen a video on YouTube depicting the West Los Angeles ring machine, although I wasn't able to find it when I looked for it recently. And certainly the Connections Museum in Seattle has several videos of ring machines, especially our beloved City Ring. And one thing I should mention, the early incarnations of City Ring didn't sound like City Ring. They sounded more like CDO Ring, except it was a distinct sound. In New York City, the first panel switching system offices appear to have had this ring. Which we called Gedney Ring after some of the exchanges in Brooklyn that had the exchange name Gedney, specifically Gedney 5, 6, and 8. By the early 1970s, there were only 3 panels left that had this kind of ring. The others had all become City Ring. But if you called the test board or the vacant code recording in the New York 4 long-distance machine, which resided in the old Western Union building, you'd get a ring like this. Same general type. But there were other City Ring type machines in New York City that seemed to have Gedney Ring as a part of their overall repertoire, even though it was only being used for things like coin collect and return power. In West 36th Street, a central office that was 100% City Ring, a power board that I found there when visiting in 1976 had some interesting little taps on it. One of them sounded like this. Another like this. But there was also this. And there's one more, which confirms that City Ring and Gedney Ring come from the same place. Listen to this. Now that is a fully synchronized combination of the 2 ring types. Effectively proving that those 2 ring sounds come from the same kind of machine. That was from 1976, but I didn't really realize what it meant until the second decade of the 21st century, when the Seattle Connections Museum confirmed, using their own City Ring machine, that yes, the 2 ring signals come from the same machine. Apparently, what started out sounding like this got updated to sound like this. And then it seems like the later models began sounding more like this. Anyway, that covers the Bell System ring machines for full-sized central offices. Now, about 4 months into my telephone interest in 1970, I ended up discovering that there was a whole other part of the network that I hadn't known about. It all began when someone on one of the meeting places, the so-called party lines that I was using to meet and talk to other kids, said that there was a new meeting place. The new party line, 212-780-62 something. Here's what I heard when I tried it.
Whatever I can get on. Hello? You're not going to be changing, Howie? Hello? Well, who's on?
This so-called party line was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Every time a new person would connect to the line, there was a very loud and unmistakable sound.
Jay?
What?
I'm getting off.
I'm going to get off a little while. Hello? Hello?
It had kind of an eerie feeling to it. Not the fact that you could tell when someone got on, but just the noise.
I'm going to get Hello? Hello? I don't have any gin left. I'll buy a bottle of gin. All right.
After that first example of this kind of a meeting place got shut down, I began investigating the telephone system that it was coming from. And clearly, this was in a whole different part of the network. Since this 780 exchange in New York City appeared to be something unusual compared to others, I decided to dial around in it and see what I could find. Now, most of the numbers I tried in 780 ended up doing this. These ringtones were different from what I had ever heard before. For one thing, the ring was always very short, half the length of a normal ring, and it repeated more frequently. And the actual pitch of these ring sounds was kind of nondescript compared to the definite pitch of the rings that I was more accustomed to. So this 780 exchange had some sort of circuitry which was unlike that which served regular phones in the New York area. And then there was the fact that the ringtones varied. One part of 780 sounded like this, while another sounded like this. And that variation was unlike the regular telephone exchanges, which had the same ring no matter what number you dialed. And at this point, it finally dawned on me what it was I was looking at. The 780 exchange was a collection of mini exchanges, each one for a different company or organization. They all had vacant number recordings, and sometimes the recordings broke down, which was what the first 78062 conference was. Early on, I didn't know what these things were called, so I called them sub-exchanges. Much later, I learned that they're called PBXs, private branch exchanges, and that for the most part, the telephone equipment is actually on the customer's premises. Now, the phone company had a special service called Centrex CU, which enabled you to dial into a private branch exchange without going through an operator. And because you could dial right into these things, that's why there were all these strange-sounding PBX rings that I could just dial right up and hear. So as I researched, I quickly got to know a whole other set of ringtones. I recall discussing this with Joe Ingressia, Joy Bubbles, and to his ears, there were two distinct Bell System PBX rings. The low PBX ring and the high PBX ring. And when he said that to me, way back then, I kind of nodded my head in agreement because I certainly could find examples. There is a low-pitched PBX ring. Typically, it has kind of a 40 Hz modulation, like this. In fact, the Avis 222 conference, which was the first one that I founded all by myself, had a ring similar to that.
This is a recorded announcement. Avis World Headquarters is closed.
The high ring that Joe spoke of brought to mind rings that I had heard that had a 20 Hz type modulation. And I recalled the Brownsville Welfare Center Centrex CU conference line, which did have that kind of a ring, along with an eerie busy signal. But Joe, unlike Ben and me, did not live in New York City, where there were so many of these things that you really couldn't say where low PBX ring ends and high PBX ring starts. In fact, for Bell System PBXs, there really do seem to be two types, one with 40 Hz modulation the other with 20. Let's put those side by side. Now those two examples are noticeably distinct, but they have the same pitch. It goes by the PBX, not the individual line equipment being run. So there do seem to be two types, but it isn't low versus high. In fact, the following clips are all from New York, and they all have that 40 Hz modulation. Listen to the variation in pitch. You see what I mean? There's a continuum as far as the pitch of the thing. We've gone from this to this. And with the rings that have more of that 20 Hz sound, I can show you the same thing. So with Bell System PBX rings, unlike any other type, there seems to be a wide variation, and I don't know whether there are 1, 2, or more official types of machines. But I do know that you have a pitch range from all the way to, and you have 2 types of modulation sound. And that's really all I can say. Maybe the collectors can answer this question. In any case, those rings with that variation did appear on most Bell Systems step-by-step PBXs and all of the early crossbar PBXs, especially Model 756. Now on Bell Systems step PBXs, especially in Manhattan, you would often find CDO ring. And those always did vary a lot in pitch, be they used in New York PBXs or their natural environment, rural settings. I can't say rural. Now, sometime in the mid-70s, we began seeing a Bell System crossbar PBX that had real touch tone, and it did not ring like previous Bell System PBXs. It rang like this. The one we saw the most that rang like that was called a 770, but there were others who used that same ring. Meanwhile, some Bell companies, including New York Telephone, started adding crossbar PBXs made by the Nippon Electric Company, and they had a Japanese type ring. By 1970, the Bell System also had its first pulse amplitude modulation PBX. That's a time division multiplex system that isn't digital. The number 101 ESS, the first successfully deployed electronic switching system. I'm sure they were very proud about it because the switching network had no moving parts. And the first ring would just start whenever you hit the line and then fall into whatever the regular pattern was after that. And in 1975, we began seeing the Dimension PBX, a more advanced pulse amplitude modulation system. It didn't have the first long ring, but it did have a PBX-timed modern ring, like this. And that covers the standard Bell System PBX rings. Now, as for independent PBX rings, I never encountered enough of them to make any general statements. The first one I ever heard was in 1973 at Potomac Hospital in Dale City, Virginia. In retrospect, I think that was a crossbar PBX. Here's Wachovia Bank in Greenville, North Carolina, 1974. Now there's a PBX ring that is longer than 2 seconds. Most of them are about 1 second. And I think that one is a crossbar PBX too, just because of the way it clicks into the line before ringing. Meanwhile, East Carolina University, also in Greenville, had a PBX with NX1 ring.
University.
That PBX was crossbar, and it actually received MF.
Switchboard is closed.
And so I don't know whether it was a mini NX1 or just what, but it sure sounds like it. And that is pretty much the only independent equivalent to what the Bell system called Centrex CU, that is a PBX you can dial into from the outside, but it's really its own telephone system. Those are the only ones I've ever seen. Maybe if I had lived in LA, where there were large urban areas covered by General Telephone, I would have gotten a sense of how the independents handle that sort of a situation. But those examples I played, I think, are the only ones I've ever found. Well, that's all I've got to say for this program. Hopefully this will help, especially for people who are going over the old raw tapes, because I've got hundreds of hours of long-distance calls that will not be narrated, and this, plus the long-distance series that I have narrated, can act as a guide to understanding those tapes. Thanks for listening.